Hello, Kansas and Western fans. Today it's time for another episode of how I designed my individual scenes on my layout in regards to track plan and why I did things and what they all mean and so on. And so today it's time for the first half of the Wichita Yard that you see here in front of you. And this is going to be the BNSF side as it is on my layout. Now, the Wichita Yard has long been a fascination for me because I've driven over, this is a model of the I-135 bridge, but I've driven over that, I don't know, hundreds of times as I've grown up in the Wichita area. And this is basically the view you get from that bridge as you pass over, looking down the yard throat, all the tracks you see, lots of cars, and I've removed all the cars from the BNSF side just so it's easier to see the different tracks. And then obviously the large grain elevator. And so it's always something I've wanted to model as long as I've been into trains. And this is the first opportunity I've had to really do it justice. Now, in reality, both sides of this yard are actually one yard for the prototype, and it's all owned by the Union Pacific. But since the Santa Fe, now the BNSF, is my favorite railroad, basically because I'm pretty much a lifelong Kansan, and the Santa Fe was originated in Kansas, so it's kind of a state pride kind of thing, I guess you could say. But I've always wanted to do both that and the Union Pacific because both are fixtures in the state of Kansas in terms of traffic. And so that's why I decided to split this yard down the middle so I could run road names for both and have some more interesting operations as you have two different switch jobs on either side of the grain elevator, and they both have to work together a little bit down here at the end. But we'll get to that here in just a second. So what I'm going to do now is describe the purpose for every single one of these tracks so that you can gain an understanding of how I came about to design the yard layout and what the purpose of each track is. Now, I've run some operations myself in and out of the yard many times, and so I feel like I've got a good grasp for how to operate in this yard. But I'm going to go ahead and share with you the purpose for all these different tracks so that you can have a better understanding too the next time you see an operations video, or if you're one of the very lucky few that manages to make it over here to operate yourself. Anyway, so we're going to start down here in the Wichita Industrial Park actually, and this was the last track plan video I did. And you can see these two Santa Fe locomotives here. And this is one of the first yard leads. So one of the first tracks that leads into the yard. And it does so by way of the engine service facility. And that is all four of these tracks that you see here. And you can see the concrete / plastic foundations for the fueling and sanding towers and so on. So that's obviously what these two tracks are for, is the diesel fueling section here. And then this track here right in the center is kind of a pass-through track or a team track, I guess, or a ready track, I guess it's called, not a team track, where locomotives ready to go are just kind of parked awaiting orders. And then this track here on the left is a rip track for locomotives. So anything that doesn't need any major repairs or tear down, a service vehicle can pull alongside as the engine is parked here and can perform some minor maintenance. So that's the point of that track. Now, back here, we'll go back to the start here of these locomotives. Just to the left of these is the actual main line. And you can see the locomotives down there headed this way. As the main line progresses to the left here, it starts to split. And it passes around the engine service track and then does a crossover. Now the crossover leads to a second track, and I'm getting myself confused, so let me back up a little bit. So as I mentioned, the track just to the left of the locomotives is the main line, but what I forgot to mention is this turnout here in the foreground leads to a track that bypasses the engine service facility, as you can see there. So the main line is actually where you can see that little bit of cork roadbed, and then this bypass also leads to the yard. And then where this crossover is allows engines to either continue on to the rail yard or cross over and pass around that curved track that you can see that disappears on the other side of the grain elevator, and that's the Union Pacific side. And so the point for these long leads is so that I can switch out long strings of cars on that yard in any direction, or on either side of the yard back in this direction. And that was my main concern, right? So I have this really long yard, and from one wall to the end of the stub track, I believe, is about 20 feet. So I wanted to be able to pull long strings of cars and do one switch move. And so I had these long switch leads installed to allow that to be possible. If you'll remember from my track plan issue, or track plan design down here in La Junta, the switch leads are much shorter, and that leads to switch crews having to perform some calculations and make sure they don't pull too many cars so that there's enough room on the switch leads. Well, up here in the Wichita yard, we don't have that problem. I can pull an entire track full of cars using these long switch leads without having to worry about how many cars I'm pulling. Okay, so anyway, so you have these two tracks here, and they're both switch leads. One leads straight down that way and then goes around the grain elevator. This middle one is the primary switch lead that follows just to this side of the elevator, and then goes all the way down to the end of that stub track. And that is the arrival departure track. And I'm going to switch ends of the yard here to make this a little bit simpler. But before I do, the engine service tracks, and you can see those three peeling off there, they are all double-ended, and they all rejoin the yard in this area here. And then in the foreground, this is the boulevard track that allows locomotives to pass completely around the yard to enter and exit the engine service track. And then here you see just one of the yard throat tracks that feeds about half of the yard. And it is the one that I talked about earlier that splits off from the main line. And that just performs a long switch lead maneuver there. All right, so we're going to move to the other end of the yard so I can start to point out tracks really quick and all their purposes. Okay, this time I actually have something to point with. So we're going to start right here. That's the main line as it comes in. So that's the arrival departure track. So trains that come in arrive on this track and then park, and then the locomotive will leave that track, or that train. And I've shown this in one of my most recent operations videos. And it will uncouple in this area here and then pull forward to reach right there, and then cross over and go all the way to the right edge of the entire yard along that boulevard track to reach the engine service facility. Now for a train that's leaving, obviously the locomotives will be placed at the other end. The engine service facility, being double-ended, allows locomotives to actually go in this direction and then pass back down and this switch lead here, which eventually leads to the front of the arrival departure track, and then it can maneuver out of the yard back in that direction. So that's kind of the issue about having a single-ended yard, is everything has to arrive and depart in the same direction, and can't just pull off in that direction there. And so my engine service terminal is double-ended for that reason, among others, but that makes that much easier. Okay, as I mentioned, this is the main line. To the left of the main line is the service track for the grain elevator. Now, I haven't built loading or unloading facilities onto this elevator yet because the elevator is still just mocked up at this point. But this long track is where long strings of grain cars will be parked to be loaded or unloaded on the elevator, and then on down all the way to the end of the yard would be just a storage track for those cars, or out-of-season cars, whatever you want to discuss that there. Further to the left of the service track is two transload. Let me think of the word. Hang on. Got it. Okay. These two are interchange tracks. And you can see how the turnouts proceed from the right down this way from the BNSF side, and then from the left over here from the UP side. Now, the point of that is so that the different railroad companies can interchange cars on these two stub tracks without having to interfere in each other's yard operations. And so these two tracks are dedicated just for that. So the yard switcher from either side will bring cars that are meant to go to the other side, park them on one of these two tracks here, and then can maneuver back to their own yard without interfering in the other company's operations. Now, I don't know how common this is in rail yards. Most rail yards, I believe, are owned by a single company, so this wouldn't be an issue. But this is what I came up with my own operations, and it's led to some interesting exchanges between yards. That's kind of fun to simulate. All right, we're going to move back to the main line to start to move to the right. So again, here's the main line. And then what you have here is just a series of different body tracks. And this is where cars would be staged for outbound trains, or where cars would be pulled off of the main line as they arrived and then be sorted amongst all these different tracks. Now you can see this track here has splits at that other end and can go in either direction. And I have been using that as my own switch lead, yard master, whatever you want to say, as kind of a secondary boulevard track. So by boulevard track, what I mean is a track that remains clear or is kept clear so that locomotives, switch engines, or whatever can maneuver from one end to the other of the yard without having to worry about cars blocking the way. And so I don't always keep this track clear, but if I can, I do, because it just makes it a little bit easier to maneuver. Because if you'll see at this end of the yard, that track splits off in either direction. And so it just makes it easier to keep that track clear to perform maneuvers between these two separate storage and classification tracks. And that's all we have here in the middle is storage and classification. Now, if we swing back to the other direction really quick, this track off to the left, that there's some pieces of track stored. This is my maintenance of way yard for the BNSF side of the yard. And so obviously these are just spares of my track set aside. Eventually these will be weathered, organized, and stacked neatly. We'll probably store some cars here, maybe some ballast cars, maybe some flat cars with equipment on them, caboose or two perhaps. And so that's basically what that is. And then we'll have some machinery storage off to the side. So that'll be just kind of an interesting scene to model. But that's all that is just a maintenance of way track, a place to keep that equipment. Now back off to the right, there's really just one other aspect. And I will say down here up against the grain elevator, this stub end track here is more or less a switch lead for the elevator and where a dedicated switch engine for grain operations would be kept. I don't have a locomotive strictly for that purpose just yet, but it's something I wanted to add in case I wanted to have that facility later or that option later. So really the last two tracks that we'll explain here in the yard are these two that stub end in front of the switch or the yard office. And this is just where I like to park the switch engines or the local engines that take traffic from Wichita to points east, or actually would be west on the layout towards Garden City and the Charleston Elevator and the Wichita Industrial Park. That's where engines would be kept. And that's just for organizational value. I think I spoke to a guy I know that actually has worked in this yard, and I don't think there was any kind of procedure in place where they tried to park the engines at the end of the day at a particular point. I like it for my own operations just because it makes them easy to find, just kind of gives you a start and an end point for the day. And so that's the point of those, just a place to park a couple of switch locomotives for the yard itself. All right, so I think that pretty much explains all the trackage. It is double-ended, like I mentioned before, and that just allows me plenty of space to park trains of different types, cars, strings of cars, and allows me to maneuver to the other end of the room. Now, it was suggested early on when I was first building this peninsula that I could connect it to the other side of the room where you see the aisleway now. And the reason I chose not to do that was I didn't really need to have continuous running operations around the upper level of the layout, because all the operations on that side of the room on the upper level are out and back, and that's the way they are in reality. A train leaves Wichita, goes to El Dorado, and comes back. There is no other place to go through. So I didn't really need to have a big loop up there, and I didn't really care to have continuous operations, although I did include them on the lower level. But that's why I didn't, basically bridge this gap for the yard, because it just would have been a big broad curve. It would have been something I would have had to duck under all the time, which I really wanted to avoid. And honestly, everything that I wanted in a yard I was able to accomplish by having a stub-ended yard, but make sure that it was long enough that I could pull full trains in and switch them out. So that pretty much explains my thoughts and design for the Wichita or the BNSF side of the Wichita yard. The next episode, we'll talk about the UP side of the yard. There are some different features there that we'll discuss, but that's about it for now. If anybody has any questions about this design or have any comments, any recommendations about what they would have done different, I definitely have no problem with that. Please leave all that in the comments below. Otherwise, I guess that's about it for now. Appreciate everybody for watching and commenting. Have a great day.